The 2021 Australian Census has been released. A lot of information to go through. Peter was just going through some of it. I can't help but think that identity politics have crept in there. The first tranche reveals 1 in 10 people now claim a mental health condition, surpassing every other chronic illness. Well, this is fascinating. I'm joined now by Spectator Australia contributor and Sydney psychiatrist Tanveer Ahmed. Tanveer, thanks for your time coming on.
Great to be on.
Now, you've highlighted this point, the explosion in mental health. Now, I'll just say before we get into this, obviously, you're a psychiatrist, I don't need to tell you, but let's just make it clear. Mental health is a very serious issue, and there are many people who suffer from mental health conditions. That's why we have psychiatrists and others, LIFELINE and so on. But this explosion within the census, what do you put it down to? Is there a component of identity politics in this?
Yeah, I think there's some interesting cultural trends. So one is the reduction in how we measure diagnoses. So there's been a kind of dilution of measures. It's become more subjective. It's often a checklist. It's less about the level of impairment, often linked to questionnaires. So I think the measures have declined. Now, part of the logic of that is...
So that means you get a broader...
Exactly, it's a bigger tent.
So rather than I'm a bit down or a bit depressed, suddenly I've got mental
So it's
illness.
Medicalising a lot of things that are probably on the edge of normal.
Right.
And I think the profession sort of does that knowingly a little. And the logic is we attract more people to try and get help. But I think many of them just get stuck to a diagnosis. I think there is a component of identity politics. And what I'd refer to there, I think we do live in a cultural time where proclaiming some sort of pain incurs a bit of status. Like, right. you get attention and you do actually get a degree of status. And often with that, you get privileges. Look at race and gender is the most obvious one. But I think increasingly disability is part of that. So I think even pulling out a mental health diagnosis is a way. You look at all these sports stars pulling out mental... It's partly to say, don't scrutinise me. Right. I know I stuffed up or whatever, but hey, it's sort of a bit of a shield. But it's also sometimes a way to get status. Right? And at the moment, look at our systems like NDIS, for example. I often have to write disability provisions for schools. To be honest, increasingly now, there's big incentives for a mental health diagnosis. Right. You get provisions at school. You get extra time. In NDIS, a third of NDIS recipients have an autism diagnosis. Another fifth have some other psychosocial disability. Now, I don't doubt many of them, need a lot of the help, but a good portion are pampered and they're relatively mild disorders. So this is my concern. Now, going back to your original point, there are still groups that are probably underrepresented in mental health, like ethnic groups, regional areas. They still can't access the type of mental health that they should. But I think culturally, and actually this is another key point I'd make, increasingly we don't even have a broader language to describe our experience that's not medical. So increasingly, if I go through something difficult, in the past you might have said, oh, that was difficult, oh, geez, that was a challenge. Yeah. Increasingly now you'll say, oh, that was traumatic. Right. So what do you mean? So yes. The very language we use to describe our experience has got a medical, psychiatric edge to it. And I think that's a bigger driver. You mentioned the census, a lot more millennials. They're much more likely to latch onto this. And even a mental health label becomes another extension of their signalled identity. I'm this. I'm a dog lover, and I suffer autism, and I'm an accountant. This kind of broad identity, a mental health label, almost becomes this extra extension of this kind of what are they called? These sort of packaged combination identities.
It's fascinating, and obviously we're not suggesting that mental health is anything other than serious. But when you do have the victim status that you refer to, and we do live in an era when to be the victim gives you, as you said, this broad range of benefits. It gives you, a right to, feel special in certain areas. Are we incentivizing? It's kind of like, it's a medical term, I know, but Munchausen's by proxy was when people would transfer an illness onto a child to get that kind of whatever. Is it a kind of aspect like that?
Yeah, I think that's it. Now, sometimes it is just purely the system. For example, GPs often have to write it on a form for you to see a counsellor, even though both you and the patient may well know you don't really have something that requires a diagnosis. So sometimes it's the system and how it records it. But absolutely, I do think we have a time now where there are actually strong incentives, both social, cultural and financial sometimes, to a psychiatric diagnosis.
Fascinating. Well, Tanveer Ahmed, I'm sure it keeps you busy, but listen, that's fascinating. Look at the census, and 2 million people now with mental health problems, Australia. Very, very interesting. And we do say always that if you are suffering from any mental concerns, or if you're feeling distressed or know anybody who's feeling distressed, please call Lifeline on 13 11 14. Tanveer Ahmed, thanks so much for coming on the Bolt Report this evening.